Good morning, everyone. My name is André Hayek, and I am an MBA student at Columbia Business School. After looking at the big picture, the upcoming panels will bring a series of sectorial deep dives. We are now going into our last panel before lunch, which is extremely timely to the theme that we will discuss next: how Brazil can create a more sustainable and resilient agricultural system. Over 1 billion people already rely on Brazil's agribusiness production for sustenance and nourishment. As consumers, investors, and regulators are constantly asking for more traceability, environmental and social safeguards, Brazil has the potential to shape standards, develop and export low-carbon technologies, and collaborate with others, especially developing countries. For this discussion, I call to stage Marcus Jank, Senior Professor of Global Agribusiness and Coordinator of the Global Agribusiness Center at INSPER, Paula Costa, Founder, CTO, and Operations Director of PRETATERRA, Marta, Giannichi, Head of Operations at MyCarbon, and Plínio Ribeiro, CEO and co-founder of Biofílica, Ambipar. And to moderate, João Adrien, ESG Agriculture Head at Itaú BBA and graduate from Columbia CIPA. Thank you.
Hello. So, thank you everyone for being here today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss the challenge and opportunity for Brazilian agriculture toward this agenda that we are discussing throughout these 2 days. As you see, the agriculture sector is part of an important debate in Brazil on how we're going to transition to low-carbon agriculture. As Brazil has a clean source of energy, agriculture and land use play a very important role on GHG emissions. 27% of emissions is connected to agriculture sector and around 40% of land use change. So how we integrate this debate is very important. As we're going to discuss here, agriculture is a powerhouse in Brazil to supply the world with food, but also have very important biomes such as Amazon, Cerrado, and so on. So different from fossil fuel sector, what we need to phase out, agriculture is not about just phasing out. So the challenge is how can we integrate this agenda in order to promote this sustainable future. And I'm very lucky to have here this huge and this very important panelists here today that are working with this agenda for so long time. And to start, I will ask Marcus, you are head in the INSPER Global Agribusiness Center. And please, Marcus, give us an overview on how do you see this challenge to promote this agriculture transition in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, João. Thank you, everybody, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to try to give you an overview about sustainable and resilient agricultural systems in Brazil. And my idea is to talk about global food security and the role of Brazil in global food security, tropical technology and total productivity of agriculture, Brazil compared to other countries, and finally, land use changes and deforestation. So the first point comes from, I think food security is a very old issue and have been in the agenda for centuries, but the last 3 years were really challenging for the world. We had a combination of food insecurity after the pandemic, the war, the climate problems all over the world, not only south of Brazil and Argentina, but also in Europe, in US, in several parts of the world. And we had also inflation, high inflation of food inflation, and also energy inflation. So we had problems of food security, especially in Africa and in Asia, which were very, very important today. At the same time, we have climate insecurity. So we have a problem of food security and also a problem of climate security. And third, we have a problem of energy security. So all three problems together. And Brazil is a very important player in all three areas. In food, because today we rank number 4 in the world in production, number 3 in the world in exports, agricultural exports, number 4 in agri-food production, and number 1 in agricultural trade surplus. We have the most important trade surplus in agriculture in the world. We are today number 3 in ag exports, but we are almost reaching the US. Last year, we did $160 billion of agriculture exports. In 2020, it was $100 billion. So in just 2 years of pandemic, we had a growth of 60% in our agricultural exports due to the imbalance of the food chains, and also due to the problems of the war, because the war affected cereals and affected fertilizers and many other products in the world. So a huge increase, and 2022 was the best year ever in our agricultural exports. And this is basically because of Asia. It's not Europe anymore. 20 years ago, our client was Europe. Today, our client is China, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and in the future, India and Africa. So those are the countries where food security is a problem. 35% of Brazilian exports, the $160 billion, go to China. And 66%, 2/3, go to Asia. Correct? So China and other parts of China, 66%, only China, 35%. So this is the problem of food security. Also, we are very big in terms of climate change because we have 66% of native vegetation in Brazil, and the issue of deforestation is a global issue, especially in the Amazon. So the second point is about tropical technology. Since the 70s, 50 years ago, we've been developing what we call the tropicalization of agriculture, which was a process that Brazil is leading in the world, that started with the improvement of acidic soils and very low nutrient contents in Brazil, especially in the Cerrados. So we had the improvement of the soils, new genetic varieties adapted to tropical conditions, no tillage, which is a very important technique that we use for more than 40 years, and 82% of the farmers in Brazil have no tillage techniques. Double cropping, so we are producing soy and corn, or soy and cotton in the same areas without irrigation in the same season. So in the same raining season, we can do 2 crops. So if you are here in the States producing 3 tons of soy per hectare, we are producing 3.4 in Brazil, and another 6-7 tons of corn in the same areas. So this is double cropping. Now we have what we call crop livestock integration, which is the possibility to expand agriculture in traditional pasture areas in Brazil. In Brazil, we have 80 million hectares of agriculture and 160 million hectares of pastures. And those pastures used to be only for cattle. And now what we are seeing is a crop livestock systems where we can produce agriculture and we can also produce cattle. And finally, we are going to have more and more an integration with forests, energy, etc. Also, biofuels, it's a very important issue. We have a very important presence of biofuels. Just to end, João, illegal deforestation. So this is the bad part, correct? We still have 1.2 million hectares of deforestation in Brazil per year, especially in the Amazon biome, and we are number 1 in the world in deforestation. So this is a very bad rank for Brazil. Land use changes represent 50% of our emissions. So this is the only big problem that we have, and we saw this in all other presentations. 2/3 of this deforestation comes from private sector control. Indigenous areas, conservation unities, non-designated areas. We have 100 million hectares of non-designated land in Brazil, so land with no owners, and rural settlements. So the solution is command and control that we didn't have in the last years, and this was the big problem of increase of deforestation in Brazil, the implementation of the forest code, and the regularization of land property rights. So this is our agenda, the hard agenda. But we also have solutions. We are at the same time villains when we talk about all the deforestation is, but we also are a solution in tropical conditions.
Great.
Thank you.
So, Marcos, thank you very much for this overview. Yes, the territory issue in Brazil, especially in Amazon, is a great problem. But when you're talking about technologies, as Marco mentioned, we have developed adapted technologies to the tropical region, which is able to absorb carbon and increase resilience. And Marta, I would like to ask you to comment on that. You are part of the Minerva food company, which is the largest slaughterhouse in the world, and livestock is a very, very central debate on this issue. You are in the spotlight, so I'd like to know how are you looking to this context on your sector? Thank you, Marta.
Well, thank you, João. Thank you all for the invite. It's very timely, this discussion, not only in time, but in this event as well, because I heard a lot in the previous panels, people talking about sustainable beef production and how it can play a very important role in repositioning the sector. Because it's, as Marcos said, it's about food security. So how we can align tropical technologies with food security, so we have food security and tackling climate change all aligned. One thing that is important to say, and it's a buzzword, is regenerative agriculture, and it goes well as well for pasture management. And we are privileged in a way in the tropics that depending on the way you manage the soil, depending on the way that you use different fertilizers, and also reducing the time to slaughter in the calves. All of these techniques that can contribute to less emissions in the food system. So what the beauty of the animal protein sector is that it can be net zero within the chain if you apply best practices. Not only technology, but there are other matters that have been surging, such as additives, biological additives that will reduce the enteric fermentation that obviously have a cooling effect because you have less methane emissions within the production. This is one technology important aspect. And the best technology of all is to integrate the food systems with crops, forest, and pasture. That's the best technology of all, because then you can have neutrality within one single farm. So Minerva is looking at it with not only with the sustainability team, but also with MyCarbon. MyCarbon is a subsidiary company of Minerva Foods that looks at originating carbon credits, and Plínio will tap on into that. But our main job is to originate carbon credits from methodologies that improve pasture management. And there is a lot of potential there. 1/4 of the global emissions can be removed with good practices in agriculture and in pasture management as well. So there is a lot of opportunity. There is a lot of opportunity to the sector. There's a lot of gaps as well, lots of challenges that we need to address. But this sustainable beef production that everyone aims at, it needs to be acknowledged, recognized, and precified in a way that we reach scale. That's the main challenge I would like to focus on.
Thank you, Marta, for your comments. I think what you mentioned is interesting because we have technologies that can lead to the decarbonization process, as I mentioned, like increasing resilience. And Plínio, you are from the founder of Biofílica and now in Ambipar company, the largest carbon structuring company in Brazil. And we are hearing a lot the discussion on carbon soil. So maybe the soil carbon could really increase the adoption of those technologies. But I would like to know your vision on that. So how do you see this carbon in soil as an incentive for adopting these kind of technologies? Thank you.
Thank you, João. Thank you all. Good morning. It's really nice to be here. I was a Columbia alumni, right, Thomas? I don't know, 15, 16 years ago. I was part of SIPA, like many of you here. And I started my career, I would say, in this school, so it's really, really nice to be here again. Yes, I've been involved in carbon markets all my life, and It's kind of new to have what we call agricultural land management as part of a category of carbon credits generation that is part of what we call NBS, nature-based solutions, which has been cited here many times in previous panels, along with REDD+ and ARR and blue carbon. I think it's important to give a little context on the size of this market. And unfortunately, we're still talking about a very, very, very small market. In 2022, the primary market of carbon credits, when I say primary, I say credits that have been taken out of the system, credits have been retired, as we call, it was on the range of $1.3 billion. That's very small, $1.3 billion. I did some Google research here, and only the amount of money that Itaú banks, that João represent, annually has a size of $20 billion. The gross revenue of Minerva in the first quarter of this year was just over $1.5 billion. So in one quarter, we have, in one company in Brazil, a larger sum than the whole voluntary carbon market in 2022. And it's not growing much. It's growing maybe 10, 15% this year. Some people expect to go close to $2 billion. I doubt, because of many things that are happening in terms of reputation of the market, which has also been cited here before. But yes, Brazil, as you all know now, is the largest, has the largest potential in soil sequestration. There are numbers that puts Brazil not only first, but it amounts for almost 30% of the potential for carbon sequestration into the soil. But we do need financing for that to happen. And that's funny coming from a carbon person, but I don't think this will only come from carbon. In fact, I think carbon will play a very small role in this financing. Why? Because we do have a lot of public instruments, a lot of public finance, a lot of private financing, right? Itaú is now the second largest bank, private bank in the agri sector. We have other large banks, Bradesco. We have the cooperatives, Sicredi. Gustavo is the director, one of the the largest cooperatives of agri credit in Brazil. So there are a lot of money to work towards carbon sequestration into the soil, not because of its carbon component only, but when you sequester carbon into the soil, you're actually increasing productivity. And then when you increase productivity, you reclaim areas, you make those areas more productive, more diverse, more resilient to climate conditions. And of course, this has an indirect effect of buying time that people wouldn't have to go in new areas to destroy forest, which we shouldn't. In fact, forests in Brazil play a fundamental role of irrigating our agriculture. Without forests in Brazil, we simply don't have agriculture, because that's our hydrologic bomb. So I think that's the context. I see potential for carbon credit financing in Brazil, but we have to go much beyond the levels of financing that happens now. McKinsey expects by 2050 to have a carbon market of $50 billion, right, in voluntary carbon markets. If Brazil gets 10% of that, some people says that Brazil could get 30% of that, but even with 10%, $5 billion is 25 billion reais. That's a lot of money for conservation practices, for financing, especially, and I'm sure Paula is going to touch on that, especially the small land owners. Because the reality is the big guys, the big farmers, they are already doing sustainable agriculture. They are already sequestering carbon into their farms, right? The ones that are not using these technologies are the ones who do not have access to finance, technology, and know-how.
Perfect, Plínio. Thank you for that. It's so good to have some sober opinions on this issue on carbon, because sometimes we see people excelling the heaven, but when we see it's not that. And also I think the point you mentioned is like we should measure carbon soil as an asset of productivity. Yes, we sometimes measure a lot of minerals, but not carbon, and carbon is especially something very, very important. I was dying to ask you, Plínio, when farmers will receive money for carbon in soil, but I will not put you in the spotlight because I know this is a sensible debate. But Paula, as Plínio mentioned, Paula, Costa, you are working a lot with smallholders to spread the use of regenerative and agroforestry systems. And we were discussing before that it's so much easier to plant like soybean or like or corn and other kind of crops, but it's so challenging to adopt and to spread these integrating systems, these models. So I'd like to ask you, how are you facing this challenge, and how are you able to spread those technologies among farmers? Thank you.
Thank you, João. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Well, when we are with our boots on the ground, talking to the farmers with areas to plant, there are many challenges we can set. And actually, I'm not sure if you guys are aware about what agroforestry means, what is agroforestry, and how it can be done. But it's simply to put trees in the landscape. Trees in the productive landscape, not only in conservation areas, but also in productive areas. And of course, we are not shading everything. We are putting trees in an intelligent manner. And that's what we do actually in PRETATERRA, is to design resilient, with trees, productive landscapes where we can have a little bit more climate resilience. But of course, it's more complex than that, but it's pretty much like this. Just put trees in the agricultural landscapes. And when you think of that, and also we don't put only one tree species, we look for biodiversity. We want not only native trees, but also trees that we can harvest something, non-timber forest products, for instance. Well, it's a complex situation. We have a lot of different species, a lot of different products. And so I'm going to try and say to you guys what I see that are the top 3 challenges that we face when we are on the ground. The first of them, I would say, is the more obvious one, which is the supply chain for agroforestry, which means where are the seedlings coming from? Where are the seeds coming from? The trees that are going to provide these seeds, they are not even mapped yet. So we still are a lot behind with the basic infrastructure for providing seeds, inputs, machinery for implementing these systems. And in each farm, each context, each community, we have a different reality. So farmers, sometimes they have a tractor available, sometimes they don't have. Sometimes they have a few implements to manage the soil, different implements, and you have to adapt the system that you're going to implement to the implements that they have available. So this supply chain to make possible that the farmers implement it on the ground, we still have to work on it. Also, the logistics related to it. So if the farmer is going to sell it, if he's going to plant like a fruit, for instance, is it what is the shelf life of this fruit? Is it going to be able to travel how many kilometers to arrive to the market? So this I would say this is the first challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Is where we can think of more opportunities to companies to start businesses focusing on that. So I'd say that's the first one. The second one is capacity building. So farmers, or ranchers, they are used to having one main cash crop. So what is the crop or the animal protein production that they are focused on? And that's the market they are looking for. They know all about it. They know the management, the inputs necessary, they know who they are selling it to, the logistics, everything about it. And if you add, for instance, just as you mentioned, if you add just corn or maize production to the pasture lands, for instance, it's already a super challenge because it's a second value chain. that you have to learn all about it. So imagine if you have 20 species in your area, in your production systems, and you're going to sell all of it. Are you going to reach the market? Do you know everything about it, to manage it, to prune the trees, to understand how they work together? So it is a complex theme. It is a complex production system. And so we like to say that the second challenge is capacity building and technical capacity building of people, knowing how to work on that. And it's funny that we have in the university, you have forest engineer, you have agriculture engineer, but you don't have an agroforestry engineer. You don't have that person, that professional that have these two skills, that know how to manage forestry species and agricultural production systems. And so that's a point that is super important. And I would say that the third one, that in my point of view is the most challenging one, is the mindset. Because people are used to, that's what they learn. That's what they learn how to do agriculture. And if you want to change that, you need to show them that it's really profitable. It needs to be clear that they are going to make their living out of it in a proper manner. So I would say that this mindset shift is the most challenging part for talking and convincing farmers to do that. That's a little bit of the challenges, I would say.
Super interesting, Paula. I think what you brought is very interesting because in this transition that you have to do, like bringing the farmers to the table and also convincing them to adopt those technologies is the challenge. And we have this first round of talks, and I would like to start with you again, Paula, to go a little further on that. Because the issue in Brazil is that 1% of farmers are responsible for 50% of GDP in agriculture. So it's a small piece of farmers that are able to produce in the scale and with the technology that we are discussing here today. In the last census, we lost farmers. So we are losing farmers in Brazil. And my question to you, Paula, is that this new technological step that we have to do you think it will put farmers behind or will exclude people from the countryside? And what kind of incentives do you think we need to discuss and able to keep those people on the business and on the ground?
Well, I would say that it's not only the agriculture change, the shift in agriculture that is going to do that. It's much more a cultural point of view. We need to make people understand that it's advantageous to live in the countryside, to live of agriculture. So it's a cultural shift. But if people on the ground have a market available, if they know who they are selling it to, if they have this security that they are going to sell their products, this is something that they will stay on the ground. They will stay on the field if they see that they can get their livelihood from that. And one movement that we have been seeing in PRETATERRA and in many other projects with our partners is that who is pushing or who is making this shift available or possible is the off-takers. So large companies or medium companies that buy products that are off-takers of agricultural production, they want to support their supply chain. They want to help farmers to do this conversion. And this is really a very valuable partnership from off-takers with their farmers that are in their supply chain, because they can not only support with, for instance, a premium price for buying the products, but also paying for the change. So selecting some of the farmers, seeing which are the farmers that are really interested in piloting and testing these new production systems, and financially supporting them to plant some pilot plots. And say, let's do a small pilot plot over here and see how it will go, and I will share the risk of this innovation, right? So we have many companies that are partners of ours doing this kind of movement. So, for instance, we have a long-term partnership with Verstegen, which is a Dutch company that buys spices from all over the world. So we did that already in Indonesia with black pepper, with vanilla in Costa Rica. So that is a huge shift for them. There is another company from Peru that is called La Grama that buys ginger and curcuma from smallholder farmers there. They did that already. So we have also here in Brazil. In Brazil, we have Natura doing that. We have Nestle doing that. So we need to see this movement growing, that this partnership between off-takers and small farmers. That will help.
That's a great point, because that maybe could be an alternative to integrate those farmers, and it's part of the idea of this panel, of this event. Now, Luciana in the beginning said about cooperation and integration, so maybe it's what you are applying on the ground. Marta, I would like to change a little bit, because she mentioned like this important cooperation with farmers, and we see that in Brazil, 40% of the pastures are in the degraded situation. So intensifying those areas could be an alternative for increased production without harming like the environment. So I would like to ask you, how are you working with farmers, and how do you see this challenge of sustainable intensification of these degraded areas?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And for you to recover degraded pasture land, I think that the landowner, the producer, they need to perceive that, and this needs to be measured, that there will be a gain in productivity, as well as you have a byproduct that's very important, that is the soil carbon. So if you have the combination of both, and then if you have the pitch to the producer and say, okay, you have to implement several techniques, several technologies here that will allow you to recover your pasture, to have a different grass, to have a different gain in productivity, and for every real that you spend, you're going to have in return 2.2. There's a McKinsey study that says that. For every real that is invested in pasture management and recovering degraded pasture lands, you have a gain in productivity. You have 2.2 gain in productivity. So that's the bottom line to the farmer. And then if you don't have those numbers ready, if you don't show that gain, it becomes an obstacle for this pasture to be recovered. So this is one. Minerva is looking at that and is working closely with farmers through a program that we call Renove, that looks at exactly like this. What is the action plan that a farmer needs to put in place that will give you gaining productivity, that will come up with a reduction of emission plan within 10 years, and as a bonus, you will have the measurements of your soil, of your carbon in the soil, that could be issued as carbon credits in voluntary markets or regulated markets. So that's the package, and it's important that this package has this priority list for the farmers, because for the farmer it's not about carbon per se; it's about gaining productivity. So this needs to be really really clear, and deliver capital for these practices, these good practices to be implemented. Because imagine you're doing your rice and beans thing every day, like we say in Brazil, and then someone comes up, say, why don't you recover your pasture land? Why don't you apply such and such techniques that will allow you to have gaining productivity? Okay, but I need some capital to invest. I need some capital to survive within those 5 initial years that the farmer will need to be doing something different than he has been doing for his whole life. So this is important to sustain and make the gaining productivity with degraded pasture lands, the recovery of degraded pasture lands, standalone. And how do you come up with the premium thing that you said is really important, because if you're applying all of those techniques, if you're trying to gain your productivity through a sustainable way of practice, this needs to have a premium price. This beef needs to have different access to markets. Markets need to price that and compare to mainstream production. So these are all things that Minerva has been looking at, has been in the forefront of trying to break these barriers and bring the sustainable label to the beef production.
Great. Good, Marta. One interesting thing, Plínio, Marta mentioned is about how to measure carbon in soil. And it's important to say that the methodology is not yet well consolidated. So we have like a very costly way of measuring carbon in soil, which doesn't allow Brazil to make it in a scalability that we need in the whole country. And also when we see the emissions in this agriculture sector, we're not counting removals. So Plínio, you are like leading the discussions on this in Brazil. I'd like to ask you, how do you see the challenge of improving methodology and how can we measure well the use of those technologies in order to give like a premium or even like incentives to use those technologies?
Right, yes. Yeah, methodology is an issue, but it's not the issue that is impeding the market to grow. I like to say that when it comes to methodology, agricultural land management is maybe 5 to 10 years behind what we've done in forest. Measuring carbon in forest, especially above ground, is much, much easier than measure anything below ground. Why? You need to dig a bunch of holes everywhere and literally measure them. Can you use remote sensing techniques? Yes, you can do a combination of them, but you cannot have a really precise measurement only using remote sensing technique if you actually can do anything with that. So yes, it is very expensive. But I think the main difference from agriculture to forest is that agriculture industry, as Marco said in the beginning, the exports, the size of the companies is absolutely much, much higher than forest. So you see big corporations, Minerva, Bayer, Cargill, you name it, all companies, banks, everyone is involved in this agenda now. So I think the path will be much faster in agriculture. We will design in the next 2 or 3 years many new ways of measuring and making. We have talent on the ground. We have the best. I can see this modest, but we do have the best tropical forest engineering schools in the world, and we have the best agriculture engineering schools in Brazil, tropical speaking. So the talent is there. There are people on the ground that can be trained to measure those, and there will be funding. But of course, it depends. Is it worthwhile measuring? Is it worthwhile designing a carbon project if there is demand? So I think the real question is demand. The real question is, are there going to be companies out there that is going to use carbon offset as part, as it was mentioned before, as part of their net zero strategy? How much are those companies willing to pay for those offsets? So I think that's a fundamental question. And if the answer is yes, there will be demand for that. I think methodology will advance very fast. We need to tropicalize those methodologies. We cannot just import European or North American methodologies because they simply won't work in the Brazilian and South American conditions, in the tropical conditions. But again, we have the talent and the schools and the minds to develop them. So I think that's not an issue. It's going to take time. And a lot of things that actually improve or sequester carbon in Brazil is already being done by Brazilians. In fact, North American carbon market for agriculture is much larger than Brazil because they're using carbon finance to start doing no-tillage agriculture here. Things that my uncle, my grandfather has been doing that for 30 years in Brazil now. And the US farmers are getting paid to do no-tillage agriculture here. So we've been doing that independently of carbon. So I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to methodology, but I'm not so optimistic when it comes to demand. Is it really going to have this demand? And since I still have another minute or two, João, I want to talk about demand on the carbon market. We are part of a group called Ecosystem Marketplace. We're actually founder members of this network. And we're about to release probably next week here in the New York Climate Week. So Ecosystem Marketplace did a study on companies that have been using offset as part of their strategy. And there's 4 findings that are, for me, it's amazing and breaks down the myth that offsets is just the easy way to become neutral. So companies that are using offsets have 10 times more investment in real reduction emissions than companies that do not use offsets, 10 times more. Companies that have a much greater ambition in their climate goals even when comparing to companies that are simply in the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiatives. Companies that use offsets have a decarbonization strategy that have 5 times more, it's 5 times more probable that they already have an internal carbon price into their strategy than companies that do not use. And all those companies that answer that research are only using offsets for 2% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we have to leave that myth that offsets is a part of the problem. Offsets is actually the part of solution, is actually something that is, people are actually reacting towards climate change. Companies must be aware of that, banks must be aware of that, because that is actually driving ambition when it comes to climate mitigation. And if that demand happens, I'm sure we can solve problems related to methodology, problems related to integrity, and problems and issues related to how we share the proceeds of this finance on a social and environmental good manner.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Plínio, for bringing this information. Marcos, I would like to ask you to jump in, because we've seen like adoption of technology, we have like kind of strategies, and we're discussing how to solve these issues, also regarding like methodology, but Brazil depends a lot on the global market, and the global market is changing a lot. We've seen like some environmental barriers being adopted by European Union and other countries, and you are working a lot with companies to discuss this issue on traceability, but also how Brazil will adapt to the new circumstances. I would like to ask you if you think that is a threat to Brazilian agriculture, or is a kind of a contribution to Brazilian agriculture, those barriers. But I would like to ask you about your view on this new global market situation.
Thank you, João. First, I would like to say that I really believe that the solution for Brazil is adaptation. It's not mitigation. Much more adaptation. So what I mentioned before, especially the productivity gains of 3% a year in total productivity gains in Brazil is really amazing. It's twice the number of the United States. It's almost 3 times more than the average, the world average in terms of productivity gain. So this is because we are doing several crops, no-tillage integration, livestock integration, food energy integration with, you see, biofuels. So all that together is a very good hope for the future, in my opinion. And for sure that we need to control deforestation. If we don't do that, we will never leave this position of a villain of the world in terms of deforestation. But coming back to the international markets, João, I'd like to say that, first of all, I see that we have, because of the deforestation problem, we are facing problems in terms of global image, global reputation, because deforestation has been growing in Brazil in the last years, especially since 2015-16, where we reached the lowest level of 500,000 hectares per year, and now we are back to 1.2, 1.3 million hectares. So this is a problem for the image, but it's not a problem for trade yet. As I told you, trade was last year the best year ever in Brazil because of the pandemic, etc. But I see restrictions coming in some parts of the world. The most important one today is the EU Green Deal and the EU Deforestation Free Regulation, EUDR. So these two legislations in Europe that will come into place, it will be the first countries in the world that will push for zero deforestation products, and independent if it's legal or illegal. So this will be a big change. For sure that Europe today is not very important for us. In agribusiness, represents only 17% of our agricultural exports, contrary to Asia, where we have 66%. But I believe that other countries, especially the US and in the future China, they will go in the same direction of having potential trade barriers related to environment and climate and also deforestation. Just a point that's very important. I don't see much movement in the Brazilian government up to now, especially in the control of deforestation in public areas. But I see a lot of movement coming from the private sector, as it was mentioned by Plínio. For example, what we are seeing today in the private companies is geo-monitoring, partial and full traceability. On the cattle industry, it's very difficult yet to do full traceability, so direct and indirect suppliers. But in many other sectors on agriculture, we have a full traceability. All the Brazilian cotton, for example, is exported with full traceability. And then we have also certifications. We have ESG policies from the companies, GHG inventories, net zero targets. So I'm seeing, coming from the private sector, not from the government yet, a movement of decommoditization. Because our exports are 100% or 95% commodities, traditional commodities, in 10 big sectors of the agri-food area. But what we are going to see is a decommoditization process, and this depends very much on the incentives. Because one thing that's missing in this area is that most of the producers in Brazil, they don't see carbon as a business yet. They don't know even what's carbon. But they are doing changes in their systems year after year in the last 30 years. They are using bio-inputs today. They are expanding crop livestock integration. There's a lot of things happening today in terms of agricultura regenerativa, generative agriculture, and also
say that.
Yeah, and also many other areas. So, in my opinion, this movement coming from the private sector is very strong. But we needed to have incentives, especially for small farmers, and those incentives are not there yet. And it means that we needed to have integrated carbon markets in the world, and we need to have incentives in place. If we have that, decommoditization will happen, and we are going to be able to split the good producers and the bad producers in terms of the markets, at the end markets.
Okay. Thank you, Marcos. I think we have 5 minutes. So 5 minutes, I would like to ask all the panelists to follow Jorge in the previews to give a selling pitch of not agriculture sector, but a selling pitch on how we need to what path we need to take in the future. So 1 minute based on your experience on how we need to walk and what path we need to take in order to have a sustainable agriculture sector in the future. Marta, if you could please bring us your side.
Me first.
Be first.
Well, I think that I tapped into topics that I would like to highlight at this point. That there is this the contribution that the beef sector can play to mitigating climate change is huge. There's a huge potential for sustainable beef production with gaining productivity and also storing carbon in the soil. This is important because this kind of carbon, it's the category that we call that is removal. And I think that in a few years' time, we're going to hear a lot about the potential that removals in agriculture have to mitigate climate change, to contribute to the sustainable beef production, and put the segment of cattle producers in a different level across the globe. So that's my pitch.
Great pitch, Marta. Thank you very much. Plínio, if you please could follow the line.
Well, I use my forest background now and say that we need, maybe as the last panelist said, Nathalie, we need more conservation work. We need to be able to actually design proper conservation projects and programs. Because yes, removal, it's important. I see a lot of attention coming from the private sector asking for removal credits. But the reality is we're going to have removal credits in 5, 10, 15 years from now. And if we keep losing forest in the same pace that we're losing now, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, it doesn't really matter to have removal credits. So we need to put the incentives in the right place, together with the command and control in the right place. We never had those two things aligned in Brazil. We had a moment from 2005 to 2013, 14, that we decreased deforestation mainly through command and control, but the incentives weren't there at the same time. And we need to really realign those things and learn how to conserve our ecosystem, because it's really the most important thing, because it links, again, to water, and it links to what has been also said here, biodiversity. So we need more conservation in Brazil.
Great, great. Incentives and command and control. Great, Plínio. Paula, please, your pitch.
Well, I would say that people are discussing that land use needs to reduce carbon emission or even be net zero. But I think that land use can be key, can play the key role for carbon sequestration if we do a different sort of agriculture, if we put trees on an strategic land use matter. So we were discussing earlier which is the best technology to sequester carbon. We already have that. Trees are it. And we need to understand and to put trees in the center of our bioeconomy. We are saying so much about it. So why don't we plant more trees? We use them as products also. If we want, we can harvest them. We can plant them to harvest within 30, 40 years. We'll have a super high quality hardwood to use it, and we'll be sure it will be stored if we use it. So we don't need to plant trees only for short-term use. We need to look at them as a product. So I think it's a huge opportunity for the market and for carbon sequestration as well.
Thank you, Paula, for your thoughts. And the final but not least, but last but not least, final pitch. Marco, please give us your thoughts.
2 points. The first one is that I really believe that we could find global solutions, and they need to be global, not national. For example, when I see the IRA subsidies in the US costing $200 per avoided ton of CO2, I think that we are misleading all the discussions, because we needed to give subsidies to the most efficient carbon mitigation, and not $200 here expanding industries that have no sense. So I think we should consider this as a global solution and not a national solution. The same problem of the COVID pandemic. We only had national solutions. We didn't have a global vision about that. So carbon is exactly the same. Second, this needs to arrive to the farmer, because you are having so many discussions everywhere, but when you go to the farm level, nobody is worried about that, because they don't see carbon as a business for them. So there's a stick and carrot game here, so we need to have the stick in the deforestation process, illegal deforestation, but we need to have the carrots, and the carrots are not there. And finally, I really believe that Brazil can lead and should lead the nature-based solutions discussions in the world, because we are very well placed in sustainable energy, sustainable agriculture, and if we do our home lesson, eliminating all the deforestation, we can lead all these discussions. We have all the conditions to do that.
Thank you, Marcos. So we are in the end of this panel. We have discussed maybe the challenge of boosting agriculture sector toward a more resilient and sustainable one. It's not easy. We need to look at resilience. We need to look at adaptation. We need to look in removals. We need to look in conservation, incentives, and how we put smallholders on the table. So it's a not easy path, but I hope that when you have your lunch today, you believe really that there is a path, and we are working toward this idea. So thank you very much for this opportunity.